At the town's sacred festival, I stood silent, while the elder called my sister's death a gift freely given. The crowd bowed, my heart burned. He didn't know I carried proof of their lies. I let them finish their chant before I spoke. When the truth spread, the council's power shattered in a single day. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The train screeched as it slowed into the station, its wheels screaming against the iron tracks, filling the gray afternoon with a metallic groan. Daniel Morgan stepped down onto the weathered platform, his suitcase heavy in one hand, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar town spread before him. The wind carried the smell of rain-soaked earth and distant smoke from chimneys, the kind of scent that clung to a place too small to be forgotten and too stubborn to change. Daniel paused. The last time he had stepped off a train, his life had shattered. This time, he told himself, it had to be different. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and walked past the peeling benches and fading posters, past a group of children chasing each other near the exit. The town looked ordinary enough, rows of red brick houses, a diner sign flickering weakly, a church steeple reaching into the clouds. But he could feel it already, beneath the surface of this place, the weight of secrets. The first time he noticed her, she was standing by the edge of the platform, clutching a leather-bound book to her chest. Emily Carter. Her presence drew the eye, not because she sought attention, but because she held herself like someone carrying invisible armor. Her dark hair whipped across her face in the wind, yet her gaze never faltered, fixed on the horizon with an intensity that hinted at wounds not yet healed. For a moment, Daniel thought she might recognize something in him too, an echo of loneliness, or maybe the quiet burden of loss. But she turned sharply away, disappearing into the cluster of townsfolk. He felt an odd pang of regret, though he had no right to feel anything at all. The boarding house was on the far end of Main Street, a 3-story building with tired curtains and chipped paint. The landlady, Mrs. Whitaker, showed him to a narrow room overlooking the street. The walls smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood, the kind of place that remembered every guest who had ever passed through. Daniel set his suitcase down and stood by the window, watching the life of the town move below him. A boy on a bicycle wove past an elderly couple. A man in a gray coat lingered by the lamppost, smoking slowly. Daniel froze. The man's posture was too deliberate, too focused. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant, Daniel felt it again, the same prickling at the back of his neck that had haunted him since he left the city. Someone was watching him. The following day, he found work at a repair shop owned by an old mechanic who barely looked up from his tools. The rhythm of fixing engines, tightening bolts, and wiping grease from his hands gave Daniel a fleeting sense of normalcy. He wanted to believe he could build a quiet life here, a life untouched by the shadows of his past. But even as he tried to settle in, the feeling of being observed never left. He noticed faces turning away too quickly, footsteps echoing just a little too close behind him after dark. That evening, he stopped by the library, its tall windows glowing warmly against the cold. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air as he walked between the shelves. And there she was again, Emily Carter, arranging books with precise, careful hands. Her expression softened when she saw him, though only slightly. "You're new here," she said, her voice low but steady. "Daniel Morgan, Jim," he replied, extending a hand. She hesitated before shaking it, her grip firm. "Emily, you'll find this town isn't very welcoming to strangers." Daniel studied her eyes, searching for what lay beneath her words. There was a guardedness there, but then also a flicker of curiosity. Before he could answer, a noise outside drew her attention, a loud thud, followed by hurried footsteps retreating into the night. Emily's jaw tightened. "People in this town," she murmured, almost to herself, "they don't like questions." Daniel left the library with a chill trailing down his spine. On his doorstep, he found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the mat. No name, no signature, just 5 words scrawled in uneven ink. "You should never have come." He stood there in the dim glow of the streetlight, the note trembling in his hand, the night suddenly alive with whispers and unseen eyes. The town had spoken. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a target. And somewhere in the dark, the man in the gray coat was still watching. The days slipped by with a quiet rhythm that felt deceptively calm. Daniel Morgan kept his hands busy at the repair shop, where the tang of oil and the constant clank of tools gave the air a heavy familiarity. The old mechanic who owned the place barely spoke, offering instructions with curt nods and grunts. Daniel preferred it that way. Work was simpler than people. Machines didn't lie, didn't keep secrets. Yet every evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows stretched across Main Street, he felt the town's eyes following him. A curtain swayed when he passed. Conversations hushed as he entered the diner. Even the shop's customers seemed to linger on his face too long before turning away. The note he had found on his doorstep never left his mind. Its 5 words echoed in his skull whenever silence settled too deep. You should never have come. One afternoon, he wandered to the library again, pulled by something more than curiosity. The building's quiet corridors offered a strange comfort, as though the rows of bookshelves stood like sentinels protecting fragile truths. Emily Carter moved between them with a stack of books balanced in her arms, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. You're back, she said, not unkindly, as she placed the books down. Daniel managed a faint smile. I figured this town's stories might be worth reading. Her gaze lingered on him, sharp and appraising, before she leaned closer, lowering her voice. Careful. Some stories here are better left untouched. Before he could press her, a child ran past, shattering the quiet with laughter. Emily straightened and returned to her work, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. That night, as he walked home, the streets felt emptier than usual. The flickering lamps cast long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, as though the darkness itself carried intention. He caught the sound of footsteps trailing his own, steady, measured. His chest tightened. He quickened his pace, heart pounding, but when he spun around, the street lay empty. Only the rustle of leaves answered him. The following evening, Jacob Reed appeared at the shop. A tall man with restless eyes, Jacob had been one of the few to greet Daniel when he first arrived. He leaned against the doorframe now, watching Daniel tighten a bolt on an engine. You're fitting in fast, Jacob said, though his voice carried an edge. Just don't make the mistake of digging too deep. People here don't like strangers poking around. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, studying him. You sound like you've got something to hide. Jacob's jaw flexed, his silence heavier than words. Finally, he muttered, I'm saying this because I've seen what happens. Some doors should stay closed. He glanced around the shop as though walls themselves might be listening, then walked away, leaving Daniel with unease gnawing at his chest. Later that week, a storm brewed out on the horizon, heavy clouds pressing low over the rooftops. The library's windows rattled as rain lashed against them, the sound drumming in relentless rhythm. Daniel found himself there again, standing at Emily's desk with the damp sleeves clinging to his arms. Strange weather, he said, watching lightning split the sky beyond the glass. Emily looked up, her expression unreadable. Strange things always follow storms. Something in her voice made him lean closer. What happened to you here, Emily? For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a quiet inhale, she said, My sister vanished, one night, years ago. No note, no trace, just gone. Her eyes, normally so guarded, flickered with a pain she tried to bury. And the worst part is, no one talks about it. Not the sheriff, not the neighbors. They pretend she never existed. This town, it eats its memories. Daniel's chest tightened. He recognized the ache in her voice, the kind that never healed but only dulled with time. I'm sorry, man, he said softly, her gaze fixed on him, unwavering. If you've come here looking for peace, you won't find it. Whatever brought you to this town, whatever you're running from, it's going to find you here. The storm raged outside, wind howling like a warning. Daniel wanted to believe her words were only fear speaking, but deep down he knew better. When he returned to the boarding house that night, his room felt colder than usual, the window rattling though it was latched tight. As he bent to place his boots aside, something caught his eye. A slip of paper lay on the floor, pushed just far enough beneath the door to be seen. His pulse quickened as he unfolded it. This time there were more words, written in the same jagged hand as before. Leave now, or you'll vanish too. The paper trembled between his fingers, the ink smeared by dampness, as though the storm itself had carried the message to him. He stood in the silence of the small room, every muscle taut, every instinct screaming at him. The town was speaking again, louder, darker, more insistent. And Daniel understood now. He hadn't stumbled into this place by accident. The town had been waiting. The scream tore through the woods like fabric ripping apart in the night. It was sharp, human, and then abruptly cut off, swallowed by the roar of the wind in the shifting branches. Somewhere between the trees, a lantern's light bobbed and faltered before vanishing entirely, leaving only the darkness behind. Daniel Morgan bolted upright in his narrow bed, breath quick and uneven. The scream had not been his dream. It had been real. The silence that followed was even worse, a suffocating stillness pressing against the window pane. He waited for footsteps, for voices, for something that might explain the sound. But the night answered with nothing but the distant creak of wood and the restless whistle of air through the gaps in the house. Sleep abandoned him. He dressed quickly, tugging on boots and stepping into the corridor where the gaslight flickered with a nervous glow. The other boarders slept undisturbed, doors closed, breaths deep. Either they had not heard it or they had chosen to ignore it. When morning came, the town carried on as if nothing had happened. Daniel stood by the shop window, his jaw tight, scanning faces in the street. People bustled as they always did. Farmers hauling sacks, children chasing eyes, women gossiping in hushed tones. Not a single one looked shaken. Not a single one mentioned the scream. Emily Carter, however, noticed his unrest when he appeared at the library that evening. She studied his face for a long moment before saying softly, "You heard it, didn't you?" Daniel's chest tightened. "You mean the scream?" She gave a single grave nod. "You're not the first. My sister, the night she disappeared, people heard it too. And yet no one spoke of it. No one ever does." Her voice dropped, brittle with anger. This town chooses silence over truth. Daniel's hands curled into fists. For too long he had carried his own ghosts locked away behind walls of denial. To hear Emily speak so plainly of hers struck something deep inside him. "I've been followed," he confessed at last, his words low but urgent. "Since I arrived, there's been someone watching. Notes slipped under my door. Threats. Last night wasn't just a scream, it was a warning." Her eyes hardened, but not with surprise. "Then it's starting again." They sat together in the dim library, the world outside swallowed by night. She told him about her sister, how she vanished without a trace, how the sheriff's search lasted no more than a week before being canceled under pressure from the townsfolk. "They said she probably ran away, but I know she didn't. I know she was taken." Daniel studied the way her hands trembled as she spoke, how her jaw clenched against the tide of grief. "You believe the same people who came for her are still here," he said. "I know they are." Her eyes met his with unshakable conviction. "And if we don't find them, they'll come for someone else." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fears. Finally, Daniel nodded. "Then we find them together." The words carried a dangerous weight, but also a strange relief. For the first time since stepping off that train, he no longer felt alone in the shadows. Jacob Reed appeared later that night, his face drawn, his voice laced with urgency. He pulled Daniel aside near the workshop, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to be listening. "You need to stop talking to Emily," Jacob hissed. "She'll drag you into something you can't escape." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about it?" Jacob's silence was telling. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, but his refusal to answer spoke louder than words. Finally, he muttered, "I tried once, I asked questions, I followed trails, and it nearly cost me everything. This place doesn't forgive curiosity." Daniel's temper flared. "Then you knew. You knew people were disappearing and you did nothing?" Jacob's gaze broke away, shame flickering across his features. Sometimes survival means silence. But Daniel had already made his choice. He would not carry silence any longer. Emily's grief was his own now, her sister's shadow entwined with his. Whatever darkness stalked the town, it would not be ignored. That night, as he returned to the boarding house, the street lay deserted under the thin slice of moonlight. The man in the gray coat stood again near the lamppost, his face veiled in shadow. When Daniel stopped, the man slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled something out. A folded slip of paper fluttered to the ground, caught briefly by the wind before landing at Daniel's feet. The man vanished before Daniel could move, swallowed into the alleys as if the night itself had opened its mouth and consumed him. Daniel bent, picked up the paper, and unfolded it with trembling fingers. This time the words were longer, written with deliberate precision. You can search all you want, but you'll never leave this town alive. His heart pounded, fear and fury twisting inside him. Yet beneath it all, a grim resolve settled into his bones. He was already too deep to turn back. The town wanted silence. The shadows wanted obedience. But Daniel Morgan had come too far to surrender to either. And to those listening now, don't look away. Every secret is clawing toward the surface, and the deeper we go, the more dangerous it becomes. Stay with me. You'll want to know what happens when the silence finally breaks. The air in the town grew heavier with each passing day, as though the weight of secrets pressed down on every street, every window, every cautious glance. Daniel Morgan felt it most in the moments of quiet, when the hammering in the repair shop fell silent, and he was left alone with the distant hum of voices beyond the door. It was in those silences that he realized how close danger had drawn. Yet in that suffocating atmosphere, something unexpected grew. His bond with Emily Carter. They met often at the library under the cover of whispered conversations and candlelight. The more she spoke of her sister, the more Daniel found his own walls crumbling. He had carried his past like a locked box, never allowing anyone to glimpse the fragments of loss and guilt inside. But with Emily, it was different. She understood the way grief shaped a person, how it hollowed them and left a permanent shadow. One evening they sat by the tall windows of the library as rain streaked down the glass. Emily traced her finger along the rim of her teacup, her expression thoughtful. You ever wonder, she said, if the people we've lost still watch us? Not like ghosts, but as if part of them lingers, waiting for us to make sense of what happened. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of faces he never spoke of the silence he had built to keep from drowning. Slowly he answered, if they are, then I hope they see me trying. Her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the walls around them seemed to fade. The bond between them grew not from words, but from the recognition of wounds carried too long. But the town refused to let them breathe. The deeper they looked, the more hostile it became. One morning, Daniel arrived at the shop to find red paint dripping across the walls. The words were jagged, smeared but clear enough. Leave. The paint dripped onto the ground, staining the dirt like blood. The mechanic said nothing when he saw it, only shook his head as if this was inevitable. The townsfolk who passed by avoided Daniel's eyes, pretending not to notice, their silence screaming louder than words. Later that night, Daniel followed Jacob Reed down a narrow street, his suspicion gnawing at him. He had seen Jacob slip into the shadows too many times, his behavior twisting with unease whenever Emily's sister was mentioned. Tonight, Daniel refused to ignore it. The street ended near the edge of the woods, where an old shed leaned against itself in decay. Daniel kept to the shadows as Jacob approached. A figure stepped out from the darkness to meet him. A man Daniel had seen before, though never this close. The stranger's eyes gleamed under the lantern light, his features sharp, dangerous. Their voices were low, carried only in fragments by the wind. Daniel heard enough to make his blood run cold. Don't let them dig, Jacob muttered. He's asking too many questions. The stranger's reply was curt, a hiss more than words. Daniel strained to hear, but a sudden crack of a branch beneath his boot betrayed him. He froze, heart hammering, as both men's heads snapped toward the noise. Jacob's eyes widened when he spotted Daniel in the half-light. For a moment, guilt flashed across his face. Guilt mixed with fear. Daniel turned and fled, the forest swallowing him in shadows. Behind him, voices shouted, footsteps pounding against the ground. He ran until his lungs burned, until the town's lamps reappeared through the trees, flickering like faint beacons in the dark. When he burst into the library later that night, Emily's eyes widened at the sight of him, his clothes torn, his breath ragged. What happened? She asked, rising from her chair. Jacob, Daniel said, his voice sharp with betrayal. He's part of it. I saw him meeting someone. He knows who's behind this. Emily's face drained of color. She gripped the edge of the desk as though to steady herself. No, Jacob. He wouldn't, but the conviction in her voice wavered. She wanted to believe in Jacob's loyalty, yet doubt had already rooted itself in her eyes. Daniel paced the floor, fury boiling inside him. The red paint, the notes, the threats, he could take all of it. But Jacob's silence, his betrayal, cut deeper. He had trusted him, even if only a little, and now he knew that trust had been a mistake. The next morning, the shop wall was clean, the red paint scrubbed away, but the stain remained in Daniel's mind. The townsfolk still avoided him, their eyes darting elsewhere. But Daniel no longer saw fear in their silence. He saw complicity. He saw a town that chose shadows over light. And in the shadows, Jacob Reed's face lingered, the truth of his betrayal echoing louder than any threat scrawled on a wall. Daniel understood now. The conspiracy was larger than whispers and warnings. It ran through the heart of the town itself, binding its people together in silence and fear. And he would tear it open, even if it destroyed him. The nightmare began with fire. Flames licked the edges of Emily Carter's vision, devouring the walls of the library until only ash remained. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard her sister's voice calling her name, faint but desperate, echoing like a cry from beneath the earth. She reached through the smoke, fingers straining, but the voice slipped further away. A shadow dragged her sister into the darkness, faceless, merciless, leaving Emily screaming until her throat tore. She woke in her narrow bed with sweat soaking the sheets, her lungs clawing for air. The room was silent, but her pulse thrashed as if the fire still burned around her. The nightmare had felt like a message, a reminder that the past was not buried, that her sister's ghost was still reaching for her through the silence of this cursed town. When she met Daniel Morgan that morning, his face carried the same exhaustion. He hadn't slept much either. His encounter with Jacob Reed the night before still bled through his thoughts like a wound that wouldn't close. He's hiding something, Daniel said as they walked through the mist-draped streets. I saw him with a stranger. They're connected to what's happening here. I know it. Emily kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though bracing against more than the cold. Jacob was my friend, she whispered. If he's part of this, then we're more alone than I thought. Daniel stopped, turning to face her. We're not alone. We have each other. That has to be enough. She searched his eyes, and for the first time in years, she let someone else's certainty steady her. Together, they dug deeper. Emily guided him to the dusty corners of the library where the oldest files were kept. Brittle papers bound with twine, boxes marked with faded ink. Hidden beneath years of neglect, they found fragments of forgotten reports, lists of names, dates, places. Each name belonged to someone who had vanished from the neighboring towns over the last decade. At the center of those names was her sister's. The ink had smudged with age, but Emily's hands trembled as she traced the letters. It was proof at last, proof that her sister's disappearance was part of something larger, something orchestrated. Daniel leaned closer, studying the patterns. They stopped investigating. Every single case. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. Someone wanted this buried. Emily's breath hitched, and Jacob knew. He said he tried once that it nearly cost him everything. He must have found this too. As if summoned by their discovery, Jacob appeared that night, his expression haunted, his voice unsteady. He cornered them in the library, his eyes darting to the shadows as though the walls themselves might betray him. You shouldn't have found those files, he whispered harshly. Do you have any idea what you've done? Daniel's jaw tightened. We know enough to see the truth. You've been feeding us half answers while people vanish. Why, Jacob, why? Keep quiet. Jacob's shoulders sagged, his fight crumbling under the weight of guilt. Because I tried. Years ago, I asked questions, followed trails. I thought I was close to something. Then one night, I came home to find my house marked with blood on the door. I heard voices outside, waiting for me to step into the dark. If Emily hadn't stopped me, I wouldn't be alive. I walked away because I had no choice. Emily's voice cracked, her grief spilling into anger. And you let them take her. You let them take my sister. Jacob's face twisted in pain. He couldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry. But what you're chasing, it isn't just one man. It's a web. And once you're caught in it, you don't escape. Daniel stepped forward, his voice a low growl. Then we'll burn the web down. Jacob shook his head, his hands trembling. You don't understand. These people own this town. They own its silence. They'll come for you next. They already have. Lightning cracked across the sky outside, thunder rolling like a war drum. The storm's fury seemed to mirror the storm building inside them. Daniel looked at Emily, saw the fire in her eyes despite the tears. They could no longer turn back. Jacob's warning only fueled them. Fear was a chain, and both Daniel and Emily were done wearing it. That night, as the rain pounded against the windows, Daniel sat alone at the boarding house, staring at the files spread across his table. The names blurred together, each one a ghost demanding justice. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. He knew Jacob was right about one thing. They were caught now, but what Jacob didn't understand was that Daniel had nothing left to lose. The silence of the town had reigned long enough. He would drag its secrets into the light, no matter the cost. And if you've stayed with us this far, don't look away now. Every revelation cuts deeper. Every step drags us closer to the heart of the darkness. Keep listening, because the truth we're about to uncover is the kind that changes everything. And once you hear it, you can't turn back. The storm did not end with the night. By morning, Blackwood streets were drowned in mud, the gutters choking with branches and debris. Yet the rain seemed almost merciful compared to the heaviness pressing down on Emily and Daniel. They had uncovered enough to know the silence wasn't natural. It was enforced, cultivated like a disease that fed on fear. Daniel carried the box of files to his room, spreading them across the desk as if arranging pieces of a broken mirror. Each scrap, each faded note carried the weight of vanished lives. Emily stood behind him, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest. She stared at the names until her vision blurred, her sister's name like a wound that refused to close. Look at the dates, Daniel said, his voice sharp with focus. Every disappearance aligns with the festival this town holds. Year after year, always during the storm season. It isn't random, it's ritual. Emily's stomach turned. The festival had been painted as a harmless tradition, a way for neighbors to gather and celebrate survival against the harsh winters. But now, that celebration felt like a mask, one smeared with blood. Jacob Reed arrived just after dawn, soaked to the bone, his eyes carrying the wild look of a man already hunted. He shut the door quickly behind him and leaned against it as if to hold back an invisible tide. They'll know you found the records, he said, his voice ragged. They always know. You don't have much time. Daniel didn't flinch. Then tell us everything now. No more warnings, no more excuses. Who are they? Jacob dragged a hand over his face, the lines of exhaustion carved deep into his skin. They're not just townsfolk. They're descendants of the original families, the ones who settled here centuries ago. When the land fought back, famine, storms, sickness, they turned to something darker for survival. They offered sacrifices, blood for protection, and the pact was never broken. Emily felt the air leave her chest as though the walls themselves had stolen her breath. You mean this curse? It's not superstition. They're still keeping it alive. Jacob's silence was the only confirmation she needed. Daniel's jaw clenched, his fists tightening on the desk. And your silence let them keep feeding it. Jacob's voice cracked. You think I don't live with that every day? I've tried to atone. I've left warnings, small acts of rebellion. But one man can't fight an entire town bound by blood. Emily stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Then it won't be one man. It will be us. Her defiance lit something in Daniel, a fire that burned away the last remnants of doubt. Together, they had stumbled too far into the darkness to retreat now. The three of them worked through the morning, piecing together the timeline. Victims vanished on the eve of the festival, swallowed by storms that always struck harder on those nights. Families left behind received no answers, only whispers and veiled threats until grief twisted into silence. Every trail led back to the same names. Families whose wealth and influence still control Blackwood. The Carsons, the Lanes, the Whitmores. Emily recognized them all. They were the smiling faces at council meetings, the benefactors of the library, the people who brought casseroles to grieving homes. Monsters hidden behind neighborly kindness. By evening, the rain had slowed, but the air was thick with dread. Jacob refused to stay. Fear gnawed at him, and though shame flickered across his face, he left them with a single warning. If you mean to face them, be ready. They don't just guard their secret, they worship it. When he was gone, Daniel and Emily sat in silence, the weight of his words coiling between them. The library's lamps cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist across the walls, as if listening. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice steady, carved with resolve. The festival is in 2 days. That's when they'll act. That's when we stop them. Emily met his gaze, her fear braided tightly with determination. The thought of standing against the very heartbeat of her town terrified her, but it was nothing compared to the thought of letting the cycle continue. Her sister's voice still haunted her dreams. If she turned away now, that voice would never be silenced. The night thickened around them, heavy and watchful. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent too quickly. The storm outside had quieted, but the storm within Blackwood was only gathering strength. Daniel placed a hand on the box of files, his touch both protective and defiant. They think silence keeps them safe. Let's see what happens when the silence breaks. The air itself seemed to tighten as though the town had heard his challenge, and in that moment, Emily realized something undeniable. They were no longer simply uncovering secrets. They were stepping into a war waged in shadows, one where truth was the only weapon sharp enough to wound. Blackwood prepared for the festival as though the storm had never touched it. By the following morning, lanterns were strung between the streets, their colors bleeding dimly through the mist. Stalls were being erected in the square. Children rehearsed songs, and neighbors exchanged practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. To Emily, it felt like watching actors on a stage. Every gesture rehearsed to hide the rot beneath. Daniel walked beside her through the square, scanning the faces, the preparations, every shadow. They're disguising fear as tradition, he murmured. You can feel it in the air, like everyone knows what's coming, but no one dares to name it. Emily's hand tightened around the strap of her bag, inside which the stolen records lay hidden. Each time she touched it, she felt the weight of those names pressing against her. They weren't just paper. They were lives stolen, swallowed by the pact that bound this town in silence. As they turned a corner, Emily froze. Across the street, Mrs. Whitmore stood speaking with the mayor, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. She looked every bit the kind matron, silver hair pinned, pearls gleaming. But Emily remembered Jacob's words. The Whitmores had always been at the center. For generations, their family had presided over the festival. And now, watching her laugh with the mayor, Emily's skin crawled. They're smiling, Emily whispered, because they already know who the next offering will be. Daniel's jaw clenched. He guided her away before the weight of her stare could draw attention. That night, they returned to the library, the box of files sprawled open like a map of hidden war. Daniel marked names, circling families, drawing lines between dates. The patterns sharpened with every stroke of his pen. Always the same bloodlines chosen, always the same orchestrators. The town complicit in its own quiet slaughter. Emily lit the last candle, shadows dancing along the spines of forgotten books. Her voice was raw when she spoke. When my sister vanished, they said the storm took her. They told me to let her go, that searching would only bring pain. But now I see it. They didn't just take her. They chose her. Daniel lifted his eyes to hers, the flame's reflection caught in their depths. Then we choose differently. We end it. A sudden knock shattered the silence. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. Daniel extinguished the candle in one swift motion, plunging the room into darkness. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by the scrape of boots against the porch. Emily's breath trembled in the shadows. She gripped Daniel's sleeve, her nails digging in. Whoever was outside didn't call their names, didn't speak. They simply waited, the silence heavier than any threat. Finally, footsteps retreated into the night. Neither moved until long minutes passed, the air thick with unease. When Daniel relit this candle, Emily saw her own fear mirrored in his face. But beneath it was something fiercer, resolve sharpened like a blade. They know, Daniel said. The files, Jacob meeting us. Someone's watching. We don't have much time. Emily swallowed hard. Then tomorrow we strike first. The hours before dawn blurred into restless fragments of planning. They couldn't confront the entire council. Not yet. But they could gather evidence stronger than whispers and faded notes. If they could expose the truth during the festival, when every eye was on the square, there would be no silencing it. By morning, Emily and Daniel moved like ghosts through the town, slipping into alleys and abandoned barns, searching for signs of where the chosen were kept before the ritual. Whispers led them to the old church on the hill, a place long closed for repairs, its doors barred, its windows dark. But from the slope, Emily swore she saw movement within, a flicker of light. Her pulse hammered as they crept closer, keeping to the shadows of broken gravestones. Daniel pressed his ear to the heavy door. Low chanting drifted through, muffled but unmistakable. Not hymns, something older, twisted. He pulled back, his expression grim. This is it. Emily's hand trembled as she touched the door, the cold wood slick with damp. Her sister had passed through here, she was certain. Others too. The thought wrapped around her throat like a noose. Tomorrow, Daniel said, voice steady despite the storm gathering in his eyes. We bring them into the light, no matter what it costs. Emily looked out over Blackwood, the town cloaked in morning fog, the square already buzzing with hollow laughter. To the people below, tomorrow would be celebration. To her, it would be judgment. As the church bell, rusted and broken, tolled once in the distance, Emily knew there was no turning back. The pact of silence had endured for centuries, but she and Daniel were about to break it. And when silence breaks, it does not shatter quietly. The night before the festival wrapped Blackwood in a suffocating stillness. Lanterns swung in the damp wind, their colors bleeding against the mist, but no laughter echoed through the streets. Doors shut earlier than usual, curtains drawn tight as though the townsfolk wished to hide from what they had prepared with their own hands. Emily and Daniel sat in the abandoned library once more, their small flame guttering against the dark. The records were scattered around them like a graveyard of paper, names carved in ink instead of stone. Daniel traced a finger down the final column, his voice low. The cycle is precise. Every 7 years, one taken. Always from families who do not hold power, never from those tied to the council. It's not chance, Emily, it's a design. Her throat tightened as she studied the names. She could almost see her sister's face among them, her smile fading into the void of absence. She pressed her palms against the table as if grounding herself in its splintered wood. They call it protection, but it's nothing more than murder wrapped in ritual. Daniel's eyes glinted in the candlelight. Tomorrow, when the whole town gathers, we show them. If they see the truth in front of everyone, they can't deny it. The council's power relies on secrecy. Break that, and we break them. Emily wanted to believe his certainty, but fear gnawed at her. She had felt the eyes watching her every step, the silence that pressed closer each night. Someone had already knocked on their door once. Next time it might not be a warning. A sudden gust rattled the broken window pane, snuffing out their flame. For a moment, only the whisper of the wind filled the space, carrying with it a chill that felt almost deliberate. Emily's skin prickled. Daniel struck a match, relighting the candle, but his face was taut. They're close. We'll need to move before dawn. They packed the records, each paper folded carefully into Emily's satchel. Her hands shook as she tied the strap, not from weakness, but from the weight of what they carried. These weren't merely documents. They were the stolen voices of generations. When they slipped into the streets, Blackwood felt hollow, the kind of silence that rang louder than sound. Even the church bell, long broken, seemed to watch them from the hill. Daniel guided her through alleys until they reached the edge of the old cemetery. Beyond it loomed the abandoned church, its silhouette jagged against the fog. By day, it was decrepit, forgotten. By night, it pulsed with something alive. They crouched behind a cracked monument, listening. From within came the same low murmurs they had heard before, rising and falling like a tide. This time it was clearer, words in a language Emily did not understand but felt deep in her bones. Her stomach turned cold. They're already preparing. Daniel's hand brushed hers, steady and warm. Then we're not too late. He drew a small camera from his coat, a relic but functional. Emily blinked at him, surprised. You had this the whole time? His mouth curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. I didn't plan to walk blind into hell. They circled the church, slipping through the broken stones of the graveyard until they found a narrow window left ajar. From there, they could see in mud. The interior was lit with dozens of candles, their flames wavering against wall blackened by soot. At the center stood the council, cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadow. Before them, bound to a post, was a boy no older than 16. His eyes darted wildly, his muffled cries swallowed by the chanting. Emily's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed to rush inside, to tear him free. But Daniel's hand gripped her arm, anchoring her. He raised the camera and clicked, the shutter a fragile sound against the storm of voices within. Photo after photo captured the scene. The cloaked figures, the terrified boy, the circle of symbols carved into the floorboards. Each image was proof no council decree could erase. When Daniel lowered the camera, Emily saw his jaw tighten. Tomorrow we show them this, in the square in front of everyone. If they still choose silence after that, then they choose their chains. The boy inside let out a desperate sob, and Emily's nail bit into her palm. She wanted to rush in, but she knew Daniel was right. One reckless move tonight, and they would join him in those ropes. The truth needed witnesses. They retreated through the graveyard, the chanting still echoing behind them. The mist thickened as they moved, cloaking their escape. Emily glanced back once. The sight of that broken church burned into her memory. By the time they reached Daniel's cabin, the horizon was already bleeding pale with dawn. Neither spoke as they laid the photographs across the table, each image a weapon forged from the darkness. Finally, Daniel said, "Tonight ends the silence." Emily stared at the boy's captured terror, her heart heavy but resolute. "And if it doesn't, then we burn it down ourselves." The festival dawned beneath a sky the color of ash, the sun muted as though it refused to bless what was to come. Blackwood Square filled slowly, people clustering in uneasy groups, their eyes darting to the church tower that loomed like a warning. Emily stood with Daniel at the edge of the crowd, her satchel heavy against her side. Inside were the photographs, each one a blade waiting to be drawn. Her heartbeat thudded so loud it drowned the murmur of voices around her. The council appeared at last, robed and solemn, their presence cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk. At their center walked Elder Hawthorne, his steps deliberate, his gaze calm with the certainty of a man who had commanded silence for decades. Behind him, the boy they had seen bound the night before was absent. Emily's stomach twisted. A hush fell as Hawthorne raised his hands. "Today we gather, as our fathers and their fathers before them, to honor the covenant that shields this town from the shadow beyond." His voice rang clear, polished, practiced. One life, freely given so that the rest may flourish. The crowd bowed their heads, some with reverence, others with resignation. Emily felt fire surge in her chest. She could not bow. Daniel glanced at her, then stepped forward. His voice, though not loud, carried sharp as broken glass. "Freely given? Is that what you call it?" Heads lifted, startled. The square rippled with uneasy murmurs. Hawthorne's expression did not falter. "Neighbor, do not let doubt poison your heart. The covenant is sacred." Daniel's jaw tightened. He pulled the photographs from his coat and raised one high. The image caught the gray light, the boy bound in ropes, the council encircling him, the symbols carved into the floor. Gasps tore through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. "Sacred?" Daniel's voice rose, unshaking. "This is not sacred. This is slaughter, hidden in shadows. Look for yourselves. See what they do in the name of protection." He passed the photographs into reaching hands. Each image traveled quickly, whispers rising into shouts. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men exchanged dark, horrified glances. The illusion of reverence cracked like glass under a hammer. Hawthorne lifted his chin, his voice iron. "Lies forged by fear. These are distortions, tricks of the eye." Emily stepped forward then, her voice trembling but fierce. "I saw it. I stood at the church window while your chants echoed like a curse. That boy did not give himself. He was taken, bound, and silenced, just as my sister was, just as every name in those records was stolen." Her words tore from her throat like a confession, and silence gripped the crowd. Eyes turned not to the council now, but to her. She opened her satchel, scattering the records onto the cobblestones. Pages fluttered, names inked in despair, generations of sacrifices erased by decree. The weight of truth settled heavy in the square. A murmur began, growing louder, fueled by rage and grief. No more. They lied to us. They took my brother. They will not take another. The chant rose, a storm gathering strength. The council shifted uneasily, their formation breaking. For the first time, Emily saw fear flicker in Hawthorne's eyes. Then the boy appeared. He stumbled from the edge of the square, wrists raw, ropes still dangling. His cries cut through the air, proof more damning than any photograph. He fell into his mother's arms, and the square erupted. The crowd surged forward, no longer bound by fear. Hands that once trembled now seized the council's robes, dragging them from their pedestal. The chants turned to shouts, to roars, to the sound of silence breaking after decades of suffocation. Emily stood frozen, breath shallow, as the tide of fury consumed the figures who had ruled with shadows. Daniel's hand found hers, grounding her in the storm. When it was done, the robes lay scattered, the council's power shattered not by fire or blade, but by truth dragged into daylight. The sun broke through the clouds then, pale but unyielding, casting its light over the bloodied square. People wept, clung to one another, whispered promises that no child would ever again be given to the darkness. Emily knelt, gathering the scattered pages, her fingers tracing her sister's name. For the first time, it did not feel like a gravestone. It felt like a vow. Daniel crouched beside her, his voice quiet but steady. It's over. She shook her head, tears blurring the ink. No, it's beginning. Now we have to rebuild, without their lies to guide us. That will be harder than anything. Daniel's hand tightened on hers. Then we begin together. The bell tower tolled suddenly, a sound long silent. It was not rung by decree this time, but by trembling hands of townsfolk reclaiming what had been stolen. Its echo rolled across Blackwood, not as a warning, but as a promise. Emily looked up at the sky, her chest rising with a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The silence had broken. At last, the town could breathe.